Welcome to Lesson 9 in Unit 17, Structure, Function, and Survival. In the previous lesson, students created a model habitat for mealworms to see how they sense and respond to their environment. In this lesson, students will use the data collected from the experiments in the previous lesson in order to design a habitat based on the mealworm's preferences. The students will test their ideal habitat and make any necessary revisions to their design. This unit sets the foundation for deeper explorations in 5th through 8th grade, where students consider plant structure and function more in depth and consider more complex descriptions of homeostasis and nervous system response. This lesson is approximately 4 days. Teachers, don't forget that students will be reusing materials from Lesson 8, including those mealworms. During this lesson, each of the 6 student groups will get a foil pan to design an ideal habitat for the mealworms and can use any of these materials provided. Disposable gloves are provided for teacher use while distributing the mealworms. They are safe to touch without gloves, but take care to wash your hands after contact. You must provide water and paper towels for this setup. They are used to observe the mealworm's preference for moisture. In the Engage portion of this lesson, students will analyze the data they collected in Lesson 8 in order to brainstorm ideas for an ideal mealworm habitat. Specifically, students should look at the conclusions they wrote on their data recording sheet and consider how they will work to build the ideal habitat during today's lesson. In the Explore portion of this lesson, students will now be given the same materials from the previous lesson and continue working in their group to design the mealworm habitat. Remind them to use the whole class evidence from their previous experiments in order to create the habitat. Each student group needs at least 5 mealworms to put in their design habitat, so make sure that you have enough remaining for the 6 student groups. They should consider mealworm light preference, food source, and water availability. At this time, students should begin building their habitat prototype. Next, students should use their engineering design cycle sheet to identify the stages that they have completed thus far. Students should be able to describe that they have now chosen the best ideas based on their previous experiments and constructed their prototype. If any groups are struggling to decide how to build the habitat, remind them that in this stage, they should just focus on building a simple prototype and that they will have the opportunity later, during the redesign phase, to make changes if desired. After the student groups have built their habitat prototypes, they will observe their mealworms and their newly designed habitats and record their observations on their Designing an Ideal Habitat for a Mealworm sheet. Make sure that each student group has 5 mealworms placed in their habitat in order to get consistent data. This phase is considered the test and evaluate step in the engineering design process. Ideally, the more time student groups have, the better, so depending on the amount of class time you have, you may want to allow the students more than one day to observe how the mealworms behave in their habitat. This step can also be done in one day if you do have limited time. As they are recording their observations, it may be helpful to have class check-ins every so often to focus their attention on details of the mealworm's behavior. For instance, discuss with students what they are seeing and why they think it is happening. Encourage them to provide evidence and give reasoning to make sense of what they are seeing in the habitat. This would also be a great time to have students share out examples of internal and external structures of the mealworm that guide its behavior. If you have not already used the Mealworm Anatomy website in Lesson 8, you should do so now. That will be found at mealwormcare.org/anatomy. In the Elaborate portion of this lesson, students will redesign their habitat with their group. Tell the students that in order to make the best design possible, they should communicate with their peers and analyze their mealworm's behavior. The students should walk around the classroom to view other groups' designs and results. Now is the time for students to look at what other groups have created and share out their own results. This can be done as a quick gallery walk or a more structured share out among the groups. During this time, circulate among the groups and note the features of the prototypes that seem the most successful. Generally, mealworms prefer darkened spaces, so look for areas within the habitat that have utilized the black construction paper to shelter them from ambient lighting. Mealworms also like slightly dampened moisture sources, such as a wet paper towel or a small pile of damp oatmeal. Too much water in the habitat will likely cause the mealworms to drown. Either the oatmeal or cornmeal food sources are acceptable, perhaps even a combination of both. When you give feedback to each group about their design, you may want to ask them how they provided shelter, water, and food to their mealworms. If they haven't thought about it or their design doesn't address that need, they will be able to make adjustments. By this point, students should have also received feedback from the other groups. Tell the students that they should incorporate this feedback as well as the evidence from their own observations in order to redesign the habitat and make any necessary changes to improve their design. Give the students time to redesign their habitat in order to create the best living space for their mealworms. In the Evaluate portion of this lesson, students will reflect on the engineering design process and determine if their mealworm habitat was a successful design. Have students record their answers to the prompts on their Designing an Ideal Habitat for a Mealworm sheet. If time allows, students can share out the features of their design habitats that were successful or unsuccessful. It is important to emphasize that changes to the habitat design are in response to the mealworm's behavior and preferred living space. To make the most of this design challenge activity, consider taking pictures of their designs or record the design process in action. If you have an opportunity for peers or other adults in your building to view the habitats and give feedback, it might be helpful for students to learn other ways to improve their designs at this time. Afterwards, ask the students to fill out the rest of their engineering design cycle handout if they have not done so already. If you are considering using any part of this lesson as a formative assessment, you could grade students on their response to the prompt, describe how the mealworm used its structures to respond to its environment. Explain how this response, the behavior, might aid in the mealworm's survival. Once this lesson has concluded, you will need to pick out the mealworms from the habitat pans and place them in a container or bag. They cannot be released into the wild because they are considered a pest species in Missouri. Please note that mealworms should not be allowed to go home with students as they will become darkling beetles and often require the assistance of a professional exterminator to rid them from a home. The best option is to give them to someone with a bearded dragon or pet reptile at home, as mealworms are a valuable food source for pets. If they cannot be made useful as a reptile food source, place the bag of mealworms in a freezer for 3 days to kill them, then discard in the trash. The building materials for the habitat, such as the construction paper and used tape, can be recycled and should not be returned in your mySci kit. If the foil pans are in reusable shape, you can empty them and put them back in the kit. The oatmeal, cornmeal, and damp paper towels can be discarded. In this lesson, students use the data collected from the experiments in the previous lesson in order to design a habitat based on the mealworm's preferences. The students tested their ideal habitat and made any necessary revisions to their design. Students figured out that we can think as scientists and engineers to solve problems. Mealworms prefer a particular kind of habitat and use their scent structures to behave a particular way that helps them survive and grow. This lesson concludes Unit 17, Structure, Function, and Survival.